Have you ever noticed how fragile a moment really is? A flower blooms at dawn, radiant and full of life, but by nightfall its petals begin to wither. The laughter of a child echoes through the room, only to fade into silence. Even the warmth of a summer afternoon eventually gives way to the cool breath of evening. Everything we touch, everything we see, everything we feel, it all slips through our fingers like water. The Buddha called this truth anicca, impermanence. Nothing lasts forever. Not the joy we cling to, not the pain we fear, not even the breath we're taking right now. And yet, despite knowing this deep down, most of us live as if time will wait for us. We save our love for later. We postpone our dreams for tomorrow. We take for granted the people we care about as if they will be with us always. But life doesn't work that way. It moves forward moment by moment, never pausing, never repeating itself. The truth is simple but piercing. Everything we hold onto will one day change, fade, or disappear. This may sound unsettling. After all, who wants to be reminded that everything they love is temporary? But impermanence is not meant to scare us. It's meant to awaken us, to shake us out of the illusion of permanence, to remind us that every fleeting second we're alive is infinitely precious. Think about it. A sunset wouldn't be breathtaking if it lasted forever. A song wouldn't touch your heart if it never ended. Even the most ordinary day becomes extraordinary when you realize you'll never live that exact day again. Impermanence gives life its beauty. It is the reason we should not waste a single breath. The Buddha once said, "All conditioned things are impermanent." When one sees this with wisdom, one turns away from suffering. He wasn't pointing us toward despair, but toward freedom, freedom from the chains of clinging, and freedom to fully embrace life as it is. So the question isn't whether things will change, they will. The real question is, how will you live knowing that nothing lasts forever? Will you drift through your days distracted and numb as time silently slips away? Or will you choose to wake up, to open your heart, and to cherish the fleeting miracle of being alive? Every breath, every smile, every tear, every touch, all of it is here only once. Right now is not a rehearsal. It is not preparation for some real life that comes later. This is it. This moment is life itself. If you have someone you love, hold them closer. If you have a dream inside you, take a step toward it. If you're breathing in this very second, let that breath be a reminder. Nothing lasts forever, and that is why every moment matters. As we continue, we'll begin to see more clearly how change shapes not only our world, but our very hearts and minds. And perhaps in embracing this truth, we'll discover that impermanence is not a curse, but the greatest teacher of all. Look around you for just a moment. The seasons shift, the sky changes colors, rivers carve new paths through stone, and mountains that once towered high are slowly worn down by the passing of time. The entire world is in motion, breathing, transforming, never still. Even the ground beneath our feet is alive with change. Continents drift, oceans rise and fall, forests grow, burn, and grow again. What feels solid and permanent is, in truth, always dissolving into something new. And it's not only the world outside. Within us, the same dance is happening. The cells in our body are constantly being renewed. The hair you brushed today wasn't there a few years ago. The heart that beats inside you has pulsed billions of times, each beat carrying you into a new moment of life. The mind itself shifts like clouds in the sky. Joy one moment, sorrow the next. Anger flares, then fades. Memories rise, then scatter like smoke. We often think of ourselves as one fixed identity, but the truth is, we are changing every single second. This is the great paradox. Everything feels so real, so solid, and yet it's all passing away. A child becomes a teenager, then an adult, then one day an elder. A house filled with laughter eventually becomes quiet. A city that never sleeps will one day crumble into ruins. The Buddha taught that this flow of change is not an accident. It is the very nature of existence. To resist it is like trying to hold back the tide with your hands. No matter how tightly we cling, life will continue to move forward. And perhaps you felt this in your own heart. The old photograph that makes you ache with nostalgia. The empty chair at the table where a loved one once sat. The friendships that faded, not because of anger, but simply because life carried you in different directions. Change is the universal law. It is what makes a sunrise different every morning. It is what gives meaning to the fleeting smile of a stranger. It is what teaches us that no two moments in this vast universe will ever be the same again. Instead of fearing this truth, what if we learn to see it as a gift? What if every sunrise became a miracle, precisely because we know it will never come back in the same way? What if every person we meet became precious, because we may never share this exact moment with them again? Impermanence is not simply an idea, it is the heartbeat of reality. And when we begin to see it clearly, life reveals a depth we may have never noticed before. The world is always moving, always changing, and so are we. But in that constant motion lies the chance to awaken, to recognize the beauty of the fleeting, and to discover a way of living that is not rooted in fear, but in wonder. And so, the question begins to stir within us. If change is inevitable, what can we learn from those who have already walked this path of understanding? What did the Buddha himself see in the changing world that set him on the journey to awakening? Long ago in northern India, there lived a young prince named Siddhartha. His life was sheltered, wrapped in luxury and comfort, guarded carefully from anything that might disturb his happiness. His father, the king, dreamed that Siddhartha would one day become a powerful ruler, and so he shielded him from the harsher realities of life. But no matter how high the palace walls, truth cannot be kept away forever. One day, Siddhartha left the palace grounds, and what he saw would change his destiny, and in time, the destiny of countless others. On his first journey outside, he encountered an old man, frail and bent, his once strong body weakened by time. Siddhartha, who had never seen old age, was shaken. He asked his charioteer, "Will this happen to all of us?" The answer was yes. On another day he saw a man stricken with illness, his body trembling, his face pale with suffering. Once again Siddhartha asked, "Does sickness come for everyone?" The answer was yes. Then came the sight that pierced his heart the deepest, a lifeless body carried to the funeral pyre. For the first time Siddhartha understood that death too was inevitable, not just for strangers but for his loved ones, for himself, for every living being. These encounters shattered the illusion of permanence. Everything he had known, beauty, strength, youth, life itself, was subject to change, decay, and loss. And yet, on his final journey outside the palace, Siddhartha saw something different. A wandering ascetic, calm and serene, walking barefoot with eyes full of peace. Despite having nothing, this man radiated a freedom Siddhartha had never witnessed before. It was in that moment that Siddhartha realized there must be a way to live in harmony with impermanence, a way to face aging, sickness, and death without despair. These four encounters, old age, sickness, death, and the seeker, became the turning point of his life. They pushed him beyond comfort, beyond illusion, beyond fear. They awakened in him a burning question. If everything changes, if nothing lasts, how can we live without suffering? And so, the prince left behind his golden palace, his silken robes, even his beloved family. He stepped into the unknown, searching not for fleeting pleasures but for timeless truth. This journey led him to the great realization that suffering is not caused simply by aging, illness, or death, but by our refusal to accept impermanence. The pain lies not in the fact that things change, but in our desperate clinging to the way we wish them to remain. Siddhartha's life teaches us something profound. Impermanence is not to be feared, it is the very key to freedom. For when we accept that change is inevitable, we loosen the grip of attachment, and in loosening that grip we discover peace. Just as the young prince awoke to this truth centuries ago, we too are invited to awaken. Every wrinkle, every farewell, every shifting season is whispering the same message. Nothing lasts forever, so cherish every moment. But even knowing this, why do we cling so tightly? Why do we resist change, even when it is as natural as breathing? If impermanence is the natural law of life, why do we struggle so much against it? Why does the simple truth that everything changes cause us so much pain? The answer lies in our instinct to cling. From the moment we are born, we begin attaching ourselves to things, to comfort, to identity, to people, to dreams. We hold them close as if they could protect us from change. Deep inside, we wish that love could last forever, that health could remain unshaken, that the people we treasure would never leave us. But the harder we cling, the more fragile we feel. Because in a world that is always shifting, nothing we grasp can remain the same. The Buddha explained this through the truth of dukkha, suffering. Suffering arises not simply because life changes, but because we refuse to accept that it does. Beneath that refusal lies tanha, craving, the thirst for things to be permanent, to stay exactly as we want them to be. And when craving hardens into upadana, attachment, we become trapped. Think of someone who clings to youth, staring in the mirror as wrinkles appear. Or the lover who cannot let go after a relationship has ended, replaying memories in endless circles. Or the person who builds their identity entirely on wealth, only to feel empty when fortune fades. We chase permanence in a world that will never give it, and so we suffer. Imagine holding sand in your hands. The tighter you squeeze, the faster it slips away. Life is much the same. We cling, hoping to keep what we love from changing, but in that very act, we guarantee our pain. Even joy can become a source of suffering when we try to trap it. Have you ever felt sad in the middle of a happy moment, knowing it would one day end? That is the mind resisting impermanence, refusing to flow with the river of time. But here lies the irony. The more we cling, the less we truly live. We spend so much energy trying to stop the tide that we forget to swim in it. The Buddha did not teach impermanence to make us despair. He revealed it so we could be free from the endless grasping, free from the chains of craving. To see that clinging is the root of suffering is to hold the key to release. And yet, letting go is not easy. Our hearts tremble at the thought of losing what we love. But what if, instead of fearing loss, we learn to hold life gently, to love fully without clinging, to enjoy deeply without grasping? This shift in how we relate to change is the very doorway to freedom. It transforms fear into acceptance, and acceptance into peace. The roots of suffering run deep, but they are not unshakable. By seeing clearly why we cling, we begin to loosen our grip. And in loosening, we prepare ourselves for the next step, learning how to face impermanence in the chaos of modern life. Step into the world today and you will see impermanence everywhere. Technology that was cutting edge yesterday is obsolete tomorrow. Companies rise and fall. Social media trends explode overnight only to vanish without a trace. What feels permanent today may be gone before we even notice it slipping away. Our jobs change. Our friendships evolve. Cities we once knew transform so quickly they become unrecognizable. And within us, the same shifts unfold. Our beliefs, our goals, even the way we see ourselves are constantly reshaped by time. And yet, despite living in an age of rapid change, we often resist it more than ever. We grow anxious when our routines are disrupted. We feel unsettled when the familiar gives way to the unknown. We cling desperately to stability, even as the ground beneath us moves. Think of the person who loses a job and feels as if their entire identity has collapsed. Or the one who cannot accept when a relationship ends, scrolling endlessly through old photos trying to relive what has already passed. Or the countless people who chase success, fame, or wealth, only to discover how quickly it can all disappear. In truth, our suffering in modern life is often magnified by speed. Change doesn't creep quietly anymore, it races. And when we try to keep pace without understanding impermanence, we exhaust ourselves, endlessly chasing after what cannot last. There's a story of a businessman who worked tirelessly, believing that once he made enough money, he could finally relax and enjoy life. But by the time he reached his goal, his health had faded, his children had grown, and the very moments he was working for were gone. He realized too late that life was never waiting for him to arrive at the perfect moment. Life had always been happening in the present, and he had missed it. This is the trap of modern impermanence. Not that things change, but that we keep waiting for the world to stop changing before we begin to live. But what if we embrace change instead of fearing it? What if, instead of clinging to what slips away, we learn to see each moment as precious precisely because it is fleeting? The truth is, impermanence is not the enemy of modern life. It is the reminder that life cannot be postponed. The hug you give today will not be the same tomorrow. The meal you share, the laughter, the silence, the tears, each is unique, never to be repeated. When we accept this, the ordinary becomes extraordinary. Waiting in traffic can be a chance to breathe. A simple conversation can become a treasure. Even struggles, when seen through the lens of impermanence, lose their heaviness because we know they too will pass. The world will keep changing faster than ever, but we don't have to be victims of its pace. By learning to live with impermanence, we can find stability not in clinging but in awareness. And so, the question deepens. If the world changes so quickly, how can we truly cherish the moments we have? How can we turn impermanence from a source of fear into the very key to living fully? There is a saying, yesterday is gone, tomorrow is not yet here, all we truly have is now. And yet how often do we actually live in this moment? Most of the time our minds wander. We replay old memories wishing we could change them. We leap into the future chasing what has not yet come. Meanwhile, the present, the only place where life is real, slips silently through our hands. Think about it. How many dinners have you rushed through without tasting the food? How many conversations have you half heard while staring at your phone? How many moments with loved ones have passed unnoticed because your mind was elsewhere? We treat the present as if it were ordinary, but in truth, it is the rarest treasure we will ever hold. The Buddha taught that mindfulness, the art of being fully present, is the path to freedom. To breathe and know you are breathing. To walk and know you are walking. To listen and truly hear. To look into someone's eyes and be fully there. These are not small things. They are the essence of life. Imagine a father who spends his days buried in work, always telling his child, "I'll play with you tomorrow." But tomorrow never comes the way he expects. One day he looks up and the child has grown, carrying memories not of play but of absence. The father realizes too late that life was not waiting for him. It was happening all along in those moments he missed. This is why cherishing the present matters, because what we call ordinary time is actually sacred. It is the space where love is shared, where laughter blooms, where healing begins, where joy is found. When we understand impermanence, we stop postponing life. We stop waiting for the perfect moment because we see that this is the perfect moment. Right here, right now. The hug you give today, the words you speak, the smile you offer, these are not small gestures. They are eternal in their own way because once lived, they can never be repeated. To cherish the present is to honor life itself. So the invitation is simple. Slow down. Notice the taste of your tea. Feel the rhythm of your breath. Truly listen to someone when they speak. Allow yourself to be here fully, deeply, wholeheartedly. The gift of now is the only gift life has ever given us. And when we finally unwrap it, we discover that happiness has been waiting here all along. But cherishing the present also means embracing its fragile nature. To love deeply is to know that one day we must let go. And it is here, in the space between love and loss, that the deepest lessons of impermanence are revealed. To love is to open ourselves to impermanence. Every bond we form, every heart we cherish, carries within it the truth that one day we must let go. And yet, does that make love any less beautiful, or does it make it infinitely more precious? There is an old story from the time of the Buddha. A young mother named Kisagatami lost her only child, and grief consumed her. She carried the child's lifeless body through the streets, begging for medicine that could bring him back. In her desperation, she came to the Buddha. The Buddha listened with great compassion and told her, "Go to every house in the village and bring me a mustard seed from a family that has never known death." With hope in her heart, Kisagatami went door to door. But every family she visited had lost someone, a parent, a child, a friend, a beloved. By the end of her journey, she realized that death was not her grief alone, but the shared reality of all beings. Through her loss, she awakened to the truth of impermanence, and in that awakening found peace. Love is fragile precisely because it cannot last forever. The people we hold most dear will not always walk beside us. But instead of making love meaningless, impermanence gives it depth. The embrace of a loved one, the laughter shared over a meal, the quiet presence of someone who understands you, these moments are priceless because they cannot be repeated endlessly. But still, the human heart clings. We resist letting go. We fight against the current of life, believing that if we hold tighter, we can stop what is already slipping away. And in that clinging, we suffer most. The Buddha taught that true love is not about possession. It is about letting the other be free. To love without clinging is to love purely, without chains, without fear. It means embracing each moment with another person, knowing it is temporary and cherishing it all the more. Loss is inevitable, but loss does not erase love. It transforms it. The people we lose remain in the way they've shaped us, in the memories we carry, in the love we continue to give because of them. To let go is not to forget. To let go is to release the suffering that comes from clinging to what cannot return. It is to bow to impermanence and to honor the gift of the time we had. So perhaps the real question is not, how can I avoid loss? Because we cannot. The real question is, how can I love so deeply, so fully, that when the time comes to let go, I can do so with gratitude instead of regret? Love, loss, and letting go are not separate chapters of life. They are woven into one. To see their truth is to discover beauty not in holding forever, but in cherishing while it lasts. And when we see that, something shifts. We begin to find beauty not just in love, but in every passing moment of life itself. Life is not made of years, decades, or lifetimes. It is made of moments. Fleeting, fragile, shimmering moments, each one arising, shining for a while, and then fading like a star at dawn. So often we miss them. We hurry past the present in search of something more, a greater success, a brighter tomorrow, a safer certainty. But in our chasing, we overlook the small treasures already glowing before us. Think of a sunrise. For a few quiet minutes, the sky becomes a painting of colors that no artist could ever fully capture. And then it's gone. If you blink too long, you miss it. Yet if you are present, even for those few minutes, it can fill your heart with awe. Or think of a child's laughter, spontaneous, unrestrained, as if joy itself has found a voice. The sound doesn't last forever, but when you're fully there to hear it, it lingers in your heart long after the echo fades. This is the gift of impermanence. Because nothing lasts, everything matters. Because everything passes, each moment becomes infinitely valuable. The Buddha once said, "Do not dwell in the past, do not dream of the future, concentrate the mind on the present moment." This is not an invitation to abandon dreams or memories. It is a reminder that the only place where life truly unfolds is here now. When we learn to see the beauty in passing moments, we stop living as if life were a rehearsal. We stop waiting for the big events to justify our existence. Instead, every sip of tea, every breath of fresh air, every touch of sunlight on our skin becomes a miracle. The truth is, most of the happiness we seek is already here, hidden in plain sight, in the ordinary, in the now. It's not that life withholds beauty from us. It's that we often overlook it because we expect beauty to look grand, permanent, or extraordinary. But imagine if you could live with the awareness that this meal might be the last shared with someone you love, that this conversation might never repeat, that this day will never come again. Would you not savor it more deeply? Would you not listen more attentively, love more freely, smile more sincerely? To cherish the present is to awaken to life itself. It is to live not in fear of what may fade, but in gratitude for what is here now. And as we learn to honor these fleeting moments, something changes within us. We discover that impermanence is not just about loss. It is also about the endless renewal of beauty, appearing and disappearing again and again. Each moment becomes a teacher, each passing instant a gift. To truly understand impermanence is not just to see beauty in passing moments, but to let that wisdom shape the way we live and the way we die. For most of us, the thought of death carries fear, resistance, and sorrow. We cling to life as if it were permanent, as if holding tighter could prevent time from moving forward. But in truth, death is not the enemy. It is part of the same rhythm that brings birth, growth, love, and change. The Buddha often reminded his disciples to reflect on death, not to invite despair but to awaken urgency. He said, "Of all the footprints, that of the elephant is supreme. Of all meditations, the remembrance of death is supreme." Why? Because when we remember that life is brief, we stop wasting it. We stop living half awake. We choose to live with intention, with clarity, with love. To walk the path fully is to embrace impermanence as a guide. It means savoring today, because tomorrow is never promised. It means forgiving quickly, because resentments are too heavy for a fragile heart. It means giving generously, because what we cling to will one day slip from our hands. And when death finally comes, it means meeting it not with fear but with peace, like a traveler returning home after a long journey, resting at last. There is a story of a Zen master who was once asked, "What happens after death?" The master simply smiled and said, "I don't know. I'm not dead yet." The answer was not careless but wise. For the master, what mattered was not speculating about an unknowable future, but living this moment so fully that when death arrives, nothing is left undone. Imagine living in such a way that when the final breath comes, you do not cling, you do not regret, you do not resist. You simply let go, like a leaf drifting from a tree in autumn, graceful in its fall. That is the fruit of practicing with impermanence, living fully, dying peacefully. This path is not about waiting for the end. It is about awakening now, about tasting the sweetness of life while we have it, about giving our presence to the people we love, our compassion to those in pain, and our gratitude to the mystery of existence itself. For the truth is, we cannot control how long we live, but we can choose how deeply we live. And in that choice we find freedom. As we walk this path with open eyes and open hearts, we discover something remarkable. Death does not diminish life, it completes it. And when we learn to accept it, we unlock the secret to living with courage, joy, and peace. There is an old story told in many Buddhist traditions. A king once asked his wise advisor, "Tell me one truth that is so profound, so universal, that it will comfort me in times of sorrow and humble me in times of joy." The advisor wrote 4 simple words on a piece of paper and handed it to the king. The words read, "This too shall pass." The king held those words close to his heart for the rest of his life. When he lost battles, he read them and found hope. When he won great victories, he read them and found humility. And when his life came to an end, those same words gave him peace. This too shall pass. Everything changes. Every joy, every sorrow, every breath. And because everything changes, every moment matters. We cannot hold on to time, but we can live within it fully. We cannot stop loss, but we can love without hesitation. We cannot escape impermanence, but we can walk with it as our greatest teacher. The Buddha taught that impermanence is not something to fear, but something to embrace. It is what makes life precious. Without endings, beginnings would hold no meaning. Without death, life would lose its urgency. Without change, love would not be as sweet. So let us cherish every sunrise, every conversation, every quiet breath. Let us forgive quickly, laugh deeply, love openly. And when life feels uncertain, may we remember, this moment is a gift, fleeting and unrepeatable. As you step away from these words, carry this truth in your heart. Nothing lasts forever, but that is not a curse. It is the very reason to live with tenderness, with presence, and with awe. And when your final moment comes, may you look back and smile, not because you held on, but because you truly lived. Nothing lasts forever. Cherish every moment. If these words have touched your heart, let them linger a little longer. And if you feel the truth of impermanence guiding you closer to peace, we invite you to walk this path with us. Subscribe to Zen Buddhism Wisdom to continue exploring timeless teachings that can bring clarity to your daily life. Share this message with those you love, for sometimes a single reflection can change the way we see the world. And as you step away, remember, the present moment is a gift. Cherish it, live it, and let it guide you home.